Well, my pleasure, really, and thank you very much. Thank you to Sanja Bojanic, to Petar Bojanic, and to Zoran Eric. And thank you to all of you and to the House of Culture. I am delighted to be here and very flattered and honored to be here with you. What I would like to present tonight is part of a project, an ongoing project, which is actually a history, a cultural history of jealousy. Not jealousy generically, but amorous jealousy, erotic jealousy. And one of the moments in this history of jealousy for me, one of the important moments is to understand when and how we started to talk in terms of the sexual object. Hence, this image that is going to accompany us tonight, that is a sort of allusion to a form of political performance that seems to me subverts in a very interesting and novel manner how we think in terms of object of desire, object, things, objectification, and subjectivity. But you will see that we are taking things, in a sense, against the grain. We are not going to follow a sort of shared and uncontroversial language. So let's start by saying that when we desire desire. We desire the desire of others. We hope to become actually the object of that desire. Love longs for reciprocity. Reciprocity makes possible recognition, gratitude, and erotic dignity. From Euripides to Ovid to Stendhal, the greatest theorists of love tell us these very simple things, which we experience anyway in our life. Now, contemporary philosophy resists thinking reciprocity. In a very interesting book, Le Don des Philosophes, Philosopher's Gift, Marcel Hénaff, an anthropologist and philosopher, shows the strange obstinacy of today's moralists to deny the dialectical exchange, give, receive, and give back, which anthropology places at the heart of the social bond. A gift, following a number of contemporary philosophers, must be completely disinterested. If you give and you anticipate to receive, you do not really give. There is something naive, I think, and overtly demanding in these normative positions. The experience of love helps us to understand, however, that to open up to another, to offer care, tenderness, fun, presents, compliments, means to engage in a relationship that is singular. By these gestures and words, we compose an encounter that individualizes the recipient. Minor differences, distinctive features, even through repetition, even in promiscuity. As collectors know very well, the Athens bronze of Félix Charpentier, say, which we cannot possibly miss, is almost the same as the previous, almost. This infinitesimal individualization, in contrast and in series, makes all the difference. With a living being, once we have identified the singular object of our desire, we want for them to do the same. And if we have been loved first, how ungracious not to pretend, at least, to be flattered. Now, contemporary philosophy is also afflicted by the cult of intersubjectivity. Despite the final criticism by Jacques Lacan in 1960, this slogan, intersubjectivity, resurfaces today, especially in the arguments of a certain casuistical feminism on both sides of the Atlantic. Lacan had initially excoriated the attempt to reduce the analytic situation to an intersubjective relationship. This pious intent missed, he said, the structural disparity of transference. Lacan then rejected the idea of oblativity, this highly moral prototype of old issues, vieilles questions. You must treat the other person as a subject, not as an object. This is an ethical posture that, for Lacan, belonged to what he called the existential analytic vocabulary of the time. It was not just a fashion for him, but a mistake. Above all, such language created a misunderstanding on the place of the object of desire. And here we come really to the core of our question. I quote, "If we do make a person into an object," said Lacan, "it will be any old object, an object like any other object, an object that can be rejected, exchanged. In short, it, the person made into an object of desire, will be deeply devalued." That is the theme underlying the idea of oblativity, end quote. Now, against this silliness, cette niaiserie, Lacan made two arguments. The first argument was that the word object, in his primary sense, aims at objects insofar as we distinguish them and can communicate. Desire, for Lacan, enhances, accentuates, accentue an object in relation, in contrast to another object. Desire draws lines of demarcation. Speaking of objects means talking of the distinctive effects of desire. The second argument was that paradoxically, I quote, "For the subjects it is much worse," because a subject, for Lacan, is defined by its submission, actually, to language. A subject does not occupy, in other words, a position of dominance, a position of control. The subject is unconscious, or more precisely, I quote, "In the subject there is a part where it speaks all by itself." To these critics, I would like to add a few considerations which relate to contemporary debates. The polarity of subject versus object produces absurd effects, I will argue, both ethical and erotic. I mean that we are now ready, in my opinion, to shed the all too familiar notion of sexual object. An American philosopher whose influence is now felt in Europe, Martha Nussbaum, has compiled a list of ways in which we may objectify a human being. These are: to treat a person as a means to our ends, as if she were devoid of autonomy and a sphere of action of her own, as if she were interchangeable with other objects, as if we did not respect her integrity, as if she were a commodity. Indifference to the experiences and feelings of a person, that is to say, the denial of her subjectivity, crowns for Nussbaum this catalogue of manners of looking at others as objects. Ray Langton adds the reduction of a subject person to a body or body parts or their appearance, and the attempt to silence women and bodies. Because the sexual act involves my pleasure, it might appear to exploit another body to this effect. Eros, for these philosophers, therefore, is the first culprit of objectification, understood also through another word very familiar to the parlance of critical theory, and this other word is, of course, reification. Now, Nussbaum forgives the literary eroticism of Lady Chatterley's lover, but not that of Playboy, and even she admits that sometimes she happens to lay her head on the belly of her lover without treating him exclusively and forever as a cushion. As the involvement of the beloved abdomen occurs in a context of respect, it is permitted. No objectification, no reification. This daring confession is just a concession, precisely, within a Kantian vocabulary, which remains for Nussbaum unquestioned. Now, this language has crept into many philosophical but also ordinary idioms in the 20th century. How did this happen? A Kantian frame, a Kantian paradigm. Let's unpack. For Kant, sexuality belongs in a wide and fundamental ethical scheme. We must relate to rational beings as ends, not as means. Means are things, people are ends. This distinction generates all the laws of the will for Kant. I quote, "The practical imperative will therefore be the following: act so that you treat humanity in yourself as well as any other person, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means." End quote. A human being is not a thing. This absolute principle compels us to condemn the reduction of others and of ourselves to the status of more or less useful, inert, exchangeable, replaceable, disposable things, goods to enjoy piece by piece. As soon as another exists or interacts with me according to my wish, desire, or pleasure, this contravenes the categorical imperative and is therefore immoral for Kant. Now, my first comment is that it is impossible to treat everyone in social life always as an end in itself. In an active life, professional life, instrumental relationships are endless and inevitable. Trivial examples: to hand a letter to an employee of the post office so that she will send it, or to do our job so that through us our students might gain knowledge, receive grades, graduate, and hopefully find a job. We engage in relationships that are subordinate to other people's purposes. We make ourselves useful, in other words, helpful, serviceable. Others help, care for, and serve us. If we consider all these exchanges as forms of mutual reification, and if we were to look for an absolute antidote to this deadly sin, we would be in trouble. No business whatsoever would be ethically acceptable. No political practice would be possible. Democracy would not be possible. Now, Kant points out, however, that we must never treat a human being only as a means. This means that we must always deal with the other in their humanity too, namely as an end in itself. We admit the existence of utilitarian relations while ensuring that they are as least instrumental and exploitative as possible. We must preserve the dignity of others and ourselves in all human interaction. Now, this is the frame. How does this relate to the question of the sexual object? Well, for Kant, sexuality is part of this elementary logic, and it is even at the heart of the problematic of moral life. Why? Well, because Kant defines sexual intercourse as the, I quote, reciprocal use, and the German word that he uses is really Gebrauch, use, a man can make of the sexual organs and faculties of another person, and such use is either natural if it procreates or is contrary to nature, and it can occur either with a person of the same sex or with an animal of another species. This transgression of the law, I'm still quoting Kant, these vices contrary to nature, which we call unspeakable, are offenses, and here we come to the point, offenses not just to morality, not to religion, but offenses to humanity in our own person. They are offensive to humanity in our own person. So no restriction or exception could possibly protect them, I'm still quoting Kant, these sexual practices, from total disapproval, absolute condemnation, end quote. So the natural character of heterosexuality depends for Kant on its purpose, procreation. Only the matrimonial contract makes sex legitimate. Any non-procreative usage, Gebrauch, of the sexual parts, including one's own parts, affects nothing less than a person's humanity. Masturbation, for Kant, is worse than suicide. Any sexual act, whatever it is defined as the handling of organs as instruments, which means the manipulation of things. I quote, "The natural use one sex makes of the sexual organs of the other is a pleasure for which each partner is engaged to another. In this act, a man makes a thing of himself which contradicts the laws of humanity in his own person." Am I doing this? Automatic punctuation to Kant's theory. So the real reification that happens here, making oneself into a res, into a thing, that is a sexual act, can only be offset by its repetition for Kant, its repetition in an immediate reciprocity. The members of a couple practice the mutual use of their bodies, thus becoming a thing for each other. Paradoxically, two things make a person. I win back my personality if once acquired by another as if I were a thing, I treat the other in turn and in return as a thing. More to the point, the use of organs, that is to say body parts, commits me to regain my integrity. Since the person is an absolute unity, the usage acquisition of a member of a part of their body, the sexual part, requires the usage acquisition of the entire person. I must contextualize sex in a monogamous marriage, the only guarantee of perfect and lasting reciprocity in use and possession. So marriage, for Kant, confers a real right. If one partner elopes, for instance, the other has the right to reclaim her, to reclaim him, as if it was a thing, as if it was property. So you see the logic of this argument. Sexuality is about using parts of the body, so if you do it, it has to be absolutely reciprocal, and it has to be forever regulated by a contract, because only the contract, in a sense, goes all the way to make that usage something legally stamped and labeled and acceptable. Now, we must take stock of the intransigence of this language. Sex is immoral because it undermines the humanity in the person. Desire and pleasure lower us to the level of the animal, for Kant, and in many erotic situations, they lead us even further down. Because sexual desire is not the attraction of a human being to another human being as such, but a penchant for the sex of the other, this desire causes the degradation of humanity. These are Kant's words. The desire that man has for a woman is not directed towards her because she's a human being, but because she's a woman. The fact that she's a human being has no interest for the man. Only sex is the object of his desire. Only sex is the object of his desire. Humanity is thus debased and subordinate. This is why all men and women do their best not to improve as persons, still Kant speaking, but to make themselves more attractive. Human quality is literally sacrificed to sex. So if a man wants to satisfy his desire and a woman her own, they try to excite each other. Their inclinations meet, but their purpose is only sex, and each dishonors the humanity of the other. They make humanity a mere instrument for the satisfaction of their desires and dishonor it by placing it at the same level as the animal nature. Sexual desire, therefore, exposes humanity to the danger, still Kant's language, Gefahr, of becoming equal to the animal. This danger comes to its realization in extramarital sex or premarital sex. And there is even worse. Sex against nature goes against the animal itself. Masturbation, we said, is for Kant not only a degradation of humanity, but a pollution of humanity in one's own person. Therefore, the pleasure of the flesh, namely voluptuous pleasure, when it is sought independently of reproductive purposes, become unnatural. So masturbation is unnatural too. More specifically, pleasure is contrary to nature whenever it is pursued, not for the sake of a real object, but for an imaginary one. So fantasy, sexual fantasy, is also unnatural. So in masturbation, following the same logic, but also in homosexuality and bestiality, man descends below animality. These forms of desire make a human being not only unworthy of his humanity, for man ceases to be a person, but lower than the beast, because animals, according to Kant, do not mate outside their species. must grasp, in addition, the resonance of this language with the Christian discourse on sexuality. Kant famously replaces the kingdom of heaven with the kingdom of ends. Reason, he says, leads us to moral duty, not religion. Revealed religion, however, performs the same kind of edification, but by other means. Other means such as scriptural narratives, which are good enough for ordinary people. So the story that Christ was born of a virgin and thanks to a virginal conception is consistent, for Kant, with an undeniable moral impact. God, who in becoming incarnate must not share the human penchant for evil, could not possibly be born through sexual intercourse. This impossibility depends upon the evil inherent in the sexual act. I quote, because natural procreation is always related to the sensual pleasure of a couple, and because for the dignity of humanity it seems to draw too close a relationship between us and the animal species in general, for this reason we consider natural procreation as something that we should blush at. The sexual act is immoral and incompatible with the perfection of a man, not to mention a god. The biblical narrative of original sin and the expulsion from paradise expresses this ethical intuition by telling us that Adam and Eve transmitted a bad inheritance to their descendants. And the church has institutionalized the same ethical intuition in the practice of monastic celibacy. So at the end of this reading of Kant's conception of sexuality, what can we say? Well, let's somehow point out the key words here: degradation, humiliation, disgrace, defilement, sacrifice of humanity. Sex is a dehumanizing, animalizing, objectifying, reifying activity. Sex transforms us into beasts and even sub-beasts, because below the sub-animals there are inanimate things. Now, forgive me for insisting, but let me emphasize again that there is no redemption, not even for conjugal sex. By definition, as we have seen, the enjoyment of the other in the sexual act is mere usage of anatomical parts made acceptable only if the other does the same by using the corresponding parts of my body. So the person is saved paradoxically only if I push to the extreme this symmetrical reification, which is also a total possession. In Kant's German, als eine Sache, as a thing, this is how I belong and I possess and I use and I'm used. Intercourse may be balanced in monogamous marriage, but in no way can it be valued. It is not a good. So chastity is a categorical virtue. It is the duty of man to himself. If the law does not frame the domestic and procreative purpose, then pleasure between men and women becomes a vice. Prostitution, concubinage, and vaga libido are nothing but appetite for a flesh which is just meat. Again, the logic that organizes the argument and runs through the metaphors is inflexible. A man is not his own property. He has no right to sell an organ, not even one of his teeth. For a person to be used by another as the object of satisfaction of sexual desire, therefore, to agree to become the object of the other's desire, means to treat oneself as a thing. One allows oneself to become a thing on which another satisfies his appetite, as he would satisfy his hunger with roast veal. So here is the veal à la mode de Kant, Kalbsbraten. Now, out of Kant, with her concern for the belly pillow of her lover, Martha Nussbaum operates within this same formatting of the erotic situation. Sex can be justified, permitted, condoned, provided that I treat the other person as a person, and vice versa. Object of sexual desire equal sexual things. But I contend this is wrong. The erotic situation is a body reaching out to another body, and a body is never a thing. Desire clings to parts and places of a living body indeed, but above all it responds to movement, postures, attitudes, and gestures which have nothing to do with things. This way of walking tells me the vitality and energy of my beloved. These eyes I look into twinkle with complicity. This lobe I chew is not a bite of scallopina. When reading Immanuel Kant, I can only long, then I talk about myself here, I can only long for Stendhal or Maurice Merleau-Ponty or Ovid. Where is erotic sex? Enjoyment is a sensation, not a usage. The flesh is irreducible to anatomy and physiology, or even less, to the Sunday roast. And above all, we badly need psychoanalysis here. We need a scholarly discourse that touches the real of eros, not the real as waste, the real as material, the real as tool, but the real experience of enjoyment. When I desire, I do exactly the opposite of objectification. I single out, rather, the special features of the other person, including her, his lively, expressive body. I hyper-personify the other person. I project intentionality onto their body. He looks at me. She smiled. He turns around. She beckoned me. Careful and apprehensive, my desire guesses and amplifies the desire of the other. Eroticism does not deal with organs, but with partial objects that signify, not with the wish to regain a lost personality, but with attention to the sensual singularity of the other and of myself. There is no use, again, there are precarious, uncertain sensations. When I'm desired, I do the opposite of self-objectification. I'm not a thing. I am a cause of desire and pleasure. I dress and perform my erotic identity in order to signify my desire or absence thereof. I'm not an absolute unity, but an unconscious subject who does not know exactly why it has to be this rather than that, which miraculously makes me feel pleasure. I'm not a person whose humanity would be violated by the pleasure of another. I feel a pleasure which is good and which makes me feel good. I have nothing to lose. I have nothing to fear. What preserves us from the meaty exploitation of others' body is eroticism. Arts of love deploy ways to offer one's own body in so many fashions to the pleasures of others. Social graces, erotic graces. Thus, it is perhaps reflecting on the context of our interpersonal relations that I allow myself to lay my head, sorry darling, on the belly of my lover, but making love is something else. Eros is otherwise demanding. He wants a living and renewed desire. We entwines with others in order to experience pleasant and thrilling, intense and beautiful sensations, and this is the end. For this, it is necessary to experiment, to vary, to discover and rediscover. It is taken the liberty to isolate the caress of this hand, the sound of this voice, the smell of this skin, that I will feel, perhaps, something. And the other, a particular person with fantasies of his, her own, will want me to do little things that trigger their erotic response. Sensuality demands the opposite of a reasonable context. It is not a means to flourishing. It might be weird, ritualized, embarrassing. In the sexual act, we do not make one, we disconnect. We cling piecemeal in surprising micro-shocks. Only pleasure matters. Of course, when we talk about pleasure, it is the antithesis of a morality based entirely on contempt for the useful and the pleasant in the tradition of Stoicism, as it is the case for Kant. But it does not have to be sad kingdom either. So, out of Kant, but how? There are many ways out of this framework, and one is Hegel. We are coming closer to today. So we learn to talk about recognition with Hegel, not objectification. This is, a crucial classical way of talking about what happens between Kant and Hegel, but it really relates to sexuality and to Eros. So with Hegel, we begin to learn to talk about recognition. We begin to talk about dialectic. Dialectic, which means not the static opposition between a subject and an object. With Hegel, we begin to talk about relationships between people, not between people and things. Hegel discusses sex and family formation in the principles of philosophy of law. From the outset, he attacks Kant. It's one of the most violent points of dissent, disagreement, and criticism between Hegel and Kant. So Hegel accuses Kant of thinking of marriage in a way that falls within what he calls shame, it must said. So Kant's way of thinking, he fulminates, is shameful. This way of thinking was haunted by the defilement of humanity in the person we have seen, but it is now itself described as a form of defilement, as a form of shame. So Hegel's criticism is violent. Why such violence? Well, because Kant makes a category mistake for Hegel. Kant has subsumed marriage under the concept of contract. But a contract, says Hegel, is defined as a transaction between two wills, that is to say, two free persons who alienate, acquire, exchange a thing. Marriage, on the contrary, has nothing to do with such definition. So you see that Hegel attacks Kant exactly on the definition of the sexual connection and its sort of legal packaging, which is marriage. It is a category mistake to think like Kant. Why? Well, because for Hegel, the union of a woman and a man creates a unit. Two individuals form a society which is in itself a moral person. The specificity of this union is love and reciprocal devotion, not use. Be it arranged by families or the culmination of passion between two individuals, marriage becomes the unit of natural sexes in a spiritual and conscious love. There is absolutely no transfer of objects or things. There is no mutual usage of organs. Hegel rejects the language of machinery and butchering. This could not be more clear. Marriage is not meant to ratify the reciprocal use of the sexual organs between two partners who treat each other as a thing. Marriage unites two people as persons. Hegel, therefore, says exactly this. One has to abandon the point of view of contract and understand that marriage is the opposite of what Kant had claimed. There is no ownership, there is no reification, no possession, no usage, no things. So Hegel points out a category mistake. Marriage must not be confused with a contract. We can see another one, which is even more significant in my opinion. The confusion between an object of, on the one hand, and an object, period, understood as a thing, on the other hand. We do not need, in fact, if we think about it, we do not need to conflate an inanimate, inert, tangible, interchangeable, available, consumable, and ready-made object thing with an object of. There is no compelling logic there. It's just a habit. In the philosophical tradition, as well as in ordinary language, the word object does not have to refer to an ontological category. This is a thing, this is a person. But it can very well, and he should, refer to a relative position with respect to a subject. Descartes, for instance, commonly evoked objects of sense, of vision, of love, of admiration, of respect. Object of designates a place that anyone and anything can occupy. It is not because I place a person or even God at the center of my visual field as the recipient of my curiosity, my attention, my respect, or my love that I convert that object of into a thing. On the contrary, I value them. I may attribute to them extraordinary charms. Stendhal, as you know, would say that I crystallize. Jacques Lacan, as we have seen, emphasizes the differential effect of desire. And above all, if I desire, I will lend to that object a lively desire for me. But it is true that if I hate pleasure, then yes, certainly, I will accuse desire itself of transforming its object and its causes into a mere thing. I will accuse desire itself, in other words, of objectifying everything it touches. So Kant does exactly that in the passage on the roast veal that we have commented upon. It is, in other words, a moral posture of disapproval adopted a priori that generates the rhetorical strategy that leads to the conflation of both senses of the word object. It is the systematic blame of pleasure at work in every sentence, every syllable of Kantian ethics that reduces eros to appetite for inhuman meat. We owe to Immanuel Kant the invention of reification. I take a minute here to ask you if it's okay if I continue a little bit more. Yes? Sonia, I'm looking at you. Yes? Thank you. Now, we are all familiar with the word reification, which has been so important in critical theory during the entire 20th century. So we can really say Kant invents the concept of reification, not the noun, in German, Verdinglichung or Versachlichung, apparently, but certainly the concept of reducing man to the status of thing. The binary ontological opposition between person and thing is actually the organizing principle of Kant's ethics. The sexual act blurs precisely this fundamental distinction. In this act, Kant says, a man makes himself a thing. Now, of course, I say man because Kant means human being, but actually means the male human being. This making himself a thing for a human being is the worst abdication. It goes against the law of humanity. So sex threatens the humanity of human beings, and we could say even the core, the foundation of human rights. It is in this reflection on sexuality that we see the emergence of a familiar language whose fate concerns us all and all, well beyond professional philosophy. Everything we say without really thinking on the representation of women as sexual objects, on objectification and self-objectification, comes from here, from Kant's erotophobic ontology. Is feminist theory deliberately Kantian? In order to understand this transmission, we have to take a short detour via Paris at the end of the 40s. We have to track down very briefly the vicissitudes of the terms precisely Versachlichung and Verdinglichung, which are often translated into French, for instance, as reification and objectification. These words belong to the lexicon of Marxist theory and German sociology. Marx mentions two paradoxes at the heart of the capitalistic production system: the personification of commodities on the one hand, and vice versa, the objectification of social relations in the form of money on the other hand. After Marx, a very complex tradition offers variations on the original idea. Capitalism implements a reduction of man or relations between men to a thing. To borrow this language means to apply a radical disapproval. As Frédéric van der Berg claims as a polemical concept, I quote, reification is the becoming thing of what in its own right is not a thing. Reification of pseudo-things is attributed to them illegitimately and as a facticity, fixity, objectivity, externality, impersonality, naturalness, in short, an ontological thingness that is deemed inappropriate. In all cases, the concept of reification presupposes an ontology which, moreover, is rarely or never explained. End quote. Now, we have seen how Kant makes his ontology quite explicit. Things are essentially non-person. Man obeys one moral imperative to avoid becoming a thing. Kantian ethics is an ethics of humanity with a capital H against the thing. And for him, the sexual act accomplishes exactly that, we said, reification. Now Marx takes his idea of reification from there. I can cite here a paradoxical witness, Louis Althusser. In his groundbreaking book on the genesis of Karl Marx's thought, Poor Marx, in 1965, Althusser had advanced the thesis of an epistemological break between the first humanist phase of Marx's thinking on the one hand and the properly theoretical and scientific period after 1845. He argued that Marx's youthful humanism was based precisely on Kantian ethics. It was based on an idealized vision of human essence borrowed from Kant and Fichte rather than Hegel. Now you will say, what's the point here? Well, you know that the classical narrative is to see Hegel talking to Kant and Marx placing himself against, with, after Hegel. Althusser says, no. The beginning of Marx theory, which was a humanistic beginning, is not with Hegel, it is with Kant. And what's the point? The point is precisely this definition, this concept of Menschheit, of human essence, human nature. So, for the young Marx, man was to reclaim his human essence, which had been objectified. So, the beginning of Marx's thought is all about precisely objectification, Althusser says. And Althusser, interestingly, liquidates this rationalist liberal humanism, as he calls it, as an ideological concept. In 1845, Marx had made a total theoretical revolution, he claimed, which was precisely the rejection of the Kantian moral idea. And interestingly enough, for the historian of Marxist political thought, in a footnote, Althusser dismisses the concept of reification altogether. In his opinion, this was a popular theory, a fashionable theory, which had become all the rage in leftist circles among intellectuals who failed to understand Marx's post-human theory. An ideology of reification which sees things everywhere in human relationship, Althusser argues, confuses under the category of thing, which is the category most alien to Marx, all social relations which are thought on the model of an ideology of money thing. So, what do we encounter here? Another category mistake, a massive misunderstanding. Now, all these interest us for two reasons. Firstly, the Kantian provenance of Marx's concern for the becoming thing of man. Secondly, the fact that among the intellectuals who follow this humanist and Kantian Marx, there is the French philosopher who has shaped the conceptual apparatus of feminism in the 20th century. Of course, Simone de Beauvoir. And I will finish on Simone de Beauvoir. In The Second Sex, 1948, Simone de Beauvoir takes up the language of man versus thing in order to think sexual difference. It is in these pages, now canonical for all of us, that several generations of feminists have learned to speak of woman as the other of man, woman as a sexual object of desire and object understood as a thing. This semantic fusion occurs at the intersection of three lines of thought for Simone de Beauvoir: a philosophy of life, Hegel's dialectic of the recognition, the Marxist conception of history. In short, very short, I promise, here is a synthesis of this montage. Humanity is gendered. In all societies and in all historical periods, men, male human beings, emerge as subjects capable of projecting themselves into the world by decision and action. They take the initiative. Thrown into a situation, they do not stay there, they struggle. In short, they transcend. Women, on the contrary, are mired in inertia, immobility, repetition. In short, women sink in the pace of immanence. It is not their fault. It is that human subjects, to exist in autonomy and to act, must feel recognition. Paradoxically, self-awareness requires confirmation and approval, validation and acknowledgement from. Since all individuals aspire to the same response, they compete for recognition. It is a struggle between the other and me. Power and domination are the result of this struggle, but it is always an unstable result. We try to realize ourselves by reducing the other into slavery, but the slave, while being exploited and humiliated, experiences their essential role for the master. I quote, by a dialectical reversal, the master appears as inessential. So revolution is possible. You recognize this language. Revolution is possible, even inevitable. Beauvoir endorses here the Hegelian dialectic of master and slave, but it is now a gendered dialectic. Manly men, she writes, have always monopolized the concrete power to enforce their economic interest, of course, but they also hold ontological and moral pretensions. So gender is based on ontological and moral pretensions. Men need the other in order to exist. The other limits and denies a human subject, but it is still necessary. If you cease to exist for others, you just collapse. It is for this reason that men have always and everywhere subjected women. Women were actually made as the other than men, other for men. Unequal and yet indispensable, inferior and yet complementary, a reflection, not a rival. At the orders of a loving and despotic man, but dependent on her, woman is in a situation that can be transformed. She may come to experience herself as essential. Emancipation is possible and indeed inevitable. So a dialectical reversal for Beauvoir will lead to a mutual recognition without struggle, finally, a fluid and immediate reciprocity in the truly democratic society announced by Marx. Beauvoir claims there is no room for the other. For the time being, woman is the other who, in the struggle for recognition, has always already lost because she will never be treated as an equal. Woman is the other which man cannot renounce because she gives him a kind of recognition that is unique. And here we come to the sexual point. This idea supports the argument of the second sex. By imposing onto women a secondary, instrumental, and auxiliary role, men subjugate women, but they deal with them quite differently compared with slaves. because they expect not only a social servitude, but also a sexual service. Although subdued, woman must be partially respected and even idealized, insofar as she remains necessary to the mechanism of fertility, life, and order of society. Women's history is the history of this complicated relationship. It is this ambivalence of the other, of the female, that will be reflected in history. Until today, woman will be subjected to the will of man, but this will is ambiguous. By a total annexion, woman would be reduced to the level of a thing. We are coming closer to really our point. Now, the full, literal, and permanent reduction of women to nothing but things is obviously impossible for Simone de Beauvoir. But the story she tells in The Second Sex is all about how women accept to become, to occupy the place of, to play the role of things. This language runs through the book. For instance, in patriarchal systems, she, woman, is the property of her father, who marries her following his will. Then, riveted to the home of her husband, she is nothing but his thing, and the thing of the genus where she was introduced. For a male subject, a woman is an object. See, really, Beauvoir speaking this language. Woman is an object. She is mere flesh. She is a thing, his thing. Woman is a fertile body in which life begins as a strawberry of blood, a trembling gelatin. She is a fleshy, abundant, sensual, corporeal mass. Breast and buttocks are a proliferation of fat that no project animates, which has no meaning other than being there. This is very Baroque, Beauvoir's language. Perceived and desired as natural, the physique of a woman is constantly modified, made artificial at the same time. Makeup, clothing, and jewelry complete the petrification of body and face. So variations on the roast veal, we could say. Now, when we read these sentences, when we listen to these metaphors, we can see the semantic shift from object of desire, of contemplation, of admiration, to object thing. Thing possessed and exchanged, taken and delivered, thing modeled and made up, adorned and decorated, thing heavy, thick, inert and dense, incapable of subjectivity and transcendence. To take in the consistency of Simone de Beauvoir is quite frightening, actually. We witness the second birth of reification. This gendered reification is also the dawn of feminist thought. We recognize the melodic lines of this intellectual music, dialectic of master and slave, Hegel, connection between private property, land of woman, Marx and Engels, but against the background of a Kantian harmony. Human beings are persons, but sex reduces them to things. Sexual desire aims at woman as sex, not as person. Beauvoir's ability to blend Hegel's dialectic and the Kantian Marxian's language of reification is quite striking. Hegel insists that the struggle for recognition involves necessarily two human consciences. Domination cannot succeed. There will be a reversal. A person cannot be made into a thing. This is the point of dialectic. Marriage, as a consequence, is a union of two persons as persons. Kant, on the contrary, as we have seen, described the success of becoming thing. This is what sex does all the time. Now, Beauvoir brings together these two lines of thought. I quote, "By a unique privilege, woman is a consciousness, and yet," so woman is a consciousness, a subject, a person, and yet it seems possible to possess her in her flesh. end quote. It is exactly in this short sentence that Beauvoir prized open her Hegelian text to the Kantian language of the thing, which runs through the second sex. This is where Hegel's and Kant's moralities blend. This junction should shock us, I think, because dialectic was expected to exceed this language once and for all. Merleau-Ponty, for instance, had perfectly understood that a human being, a human body, can never be objectified, especially not in sexuality. Desire does not care for things, but for a desiring consciousness, or, as Lacan would put it, for partial objects which act as its cause. But Simone de Beauvoir, fascinated, like so many theorists of reification, by the Kantian humanist Marx, brought Eros into the kingdom of ends, where actually there is no place for him. It is time to shed the sexual object. Thank you very much for your patience.